Hello, and thank you for joining us here at Finding the Healer Within. Today, we will be speaking with Dr. Oscar Perez, who is a trauma recovery specialist, self proclaimed underworld guide, and teacher of Toltec and shamanic wisdom for healing ancestral trauma and addiction. He's the best selling author of The Flowering War, Toltec Teachings for Healing Ancestral Trauma, Overcoming Your Internal Enemies, and Fulfilling Your Life's Purpose. He's the founder of Tending the Fires, a community and school for earth-based healing of personal and ancestral trauma. He has a PhD from Brown University and won several awards for excellence in teaching from Harvard, prior to leaving academia to create more engaged community-based work with Tending the Fires. Welcome to Finding the Healer Within. Oscar, how are you today?
I'm great, Adriana. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited about the book that I'm reading, The Flowering War, that I had actually seen one of my friends reading, and I was like, oh, I got to get that book. But it wasn't until a little bit later that I got the book and I started reading it. And like, it was so, like, I had never felt so seen in my life. It was really interesting to me. And I was like, so there's other people that get it, And so I just wanted to start, at the very beginning of your journey, if you can give us a little bit of insight into who Dr. Perez was growing up and what led you to eventually write your book, The Flowering War.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. And that's wonderful to hear that. Seriously, it's I think of this book. I hope that this book reaches a lot of people that feel the same way, that feel like they haven't been seen in this way before in their life. And every time I hear that, it's like it's medicine for my soul too, right? It's like healing for my heart. So my interest in all of the things that led to the book started when I was really, really little. And it started really when I was about 10 years old. I had my family, for various reasons, had been disconnected. And when I was around 10, we reconnected with my mother's family, with my grandfather and my aunts on my mom's side of the family. And something that occurred right at that time was that I started learning more about my grandmother's indigenous lineage. And my family's from northern Chihuahua, from the state of Chihuahua. So on my mom's side, they're from La Sierra de Chihuahua. They're from up in the mountains, from a little town called Madera.
Mhm.
My father's side is from another place. It's called Moris. But growing up, I grew up between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Texas. And I had this really, really strong pull, this really strong interest in our indigenous heritage, in that side of our lineage. And so when I was around 10 years old and we started reconnecting and spending more time with my grandfather and learning more about that side of my family, I started hearing more about my grandmother. Now, she had died before I was born, so I never got to meet her. All I heard were stories of her and who she was. And so along the lines of learning about her, I started hearing that we had this Apache lineage, right? That we had Apache or Inde descent. And as a little kid, that just captivated everything for me. It became something that really started to pull at my heart and at my interests. And at the same time, I've always been very drawn towards spiritual traditions and towards healing traditions. So when I was a kid, I had a book, I still have it actually, that like back in the day, there used to be this series of books that they would send. It was called Time Life books, right? And they would have like a series of like 11 different books, and they would send you one a month if you ordered the series, and you could just keep the one that you wanted to and then send back the other ones. So there was a series called The American Indians. And the
Mhm.
first book that we got at the house was called The Spirit World. And it was the only book that I wanted and that I like kept, and I would carry it with me everywhere when I was a little kid. And I'm talking, yeah, like 10, 11 years old. And so I would carry this book all over the place, and I was just really drawn to the stories and the pictures in it. And I was always asking people in my family for stories. And I was kind of the odd one out in that way, right?
Yeah.
It's funny because growing up throughout my life, like that's been one of those things that's even become kind of a running joke in my family, right? That
Mhm.
that I've always had that pull. Well, simultaneously with that, I was invited to go with my aunt and my uncle and my cousins to Yucatan in Mexico. And we went to Chichen Itza, which is one of the archaeological sites there. And all of these different aspects of the Yucateco culture, of the iconography of Mexico, of that part of Mexico, and these ideas of well, there it's Kukulkan, but that is very connected to Quetzalcoatl in the Nahua speaking areas and Gukumats in the Quiche areas. So all of these things started just kind of brewing in me as a little kid. And it just continued, it just started there. So that started to guide my interest in like indigenous spirituality or that part of my ancestral lineage. And at the same time, my whole life I had a really strong affinity for picking up on what was going on with the people around me.
Mhm.
So in the book I introduced this idea, this concept of the grief bearer.
Yeah.
And it is that one person over years and years and years of learning with different teachers and different traditions, I started really kind of honing in on the fact that there are certain born in every generation of every family that carry the untended grief or the unhealed wounds of the lineage, that carry them more than everybody else, because
Mhm.
everybody carries some,
Right.
but there are certain specific ones that carry more than the rest of them. And in the culture and society that we live in, there's really no acknowledgement for that up until very recently. It's
Yeah.
only happened like maybe in the last 15 years or so that people have started to talk about epigenetics and generational and ancestral and historical trauma.
Mhm.
And these things have become increasingly popular. Like, for example, now people speaking about grief, it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
But 10 years ago, you wouldn't see any of that.
Yeah, it was like a taboo subject almost. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and, growing up in a family that was very traditionally Mexican in certain ways, there were a lot of things that you don't talk about. There were a lot of things that don't get acknowledged. And there's this big division between what happens within the four walls of your house and the image that you have outside, right?
Mhm.
And so growing up, because I am that person in this generation, I was the one that was always pointing at these deeper wounds in my family, myself, in the larger community and culture around us. And I couldn't get, especially when I was really young, I couldn't really understand why people didn't want to heal the thing or didn't want to like look at and address the underlying things, why people kept pretending like everything was fine as long as it looked normal, you know.
Mhm.
And in the book I go off a bit what on how I feel about that word, right? About normal, and how I feel about these ideas of what we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to be. um in in the community that I grew up in, shame dominates most people's actions and
Mhm.
dominates most people's relationships and interactions with one another. You know, it's one of those phrases that I heard often, right? Was "No te da vergüenza?"
Yeah.
Or shame, right? And it's not done in a malicious way, so much as it's people passing on what was given to them.
Mhm.
But it is constantly orienting the person towards this idea that shame is what has to dictate the way that you see yourself and the way that you relate to the outside world, and that you have to essentially limit or govern yourself or cut off parts of yourself because they're not socially acceptable or not socially accepted, right? And along with that goes the inability or the resistance to looking at these deeper wounds that have affected a family line generation upon generation upon generation. And so growing up I was aware of a lot of these things, but there was nobody to talk to about it. As I got older, I started learning more about and being more accepted into ceremony communities, um, and like participating in sweat lodges and having teachers that were um, guides in various different kinds of ceremony in that sense. And and then I started speaking to elders from different places, and I started hearing these stories about how it is known in different places that in every generation, the person that is born that is carrying more of that energetic weight than anybody else,
Mhm.
in an intact culture, that person would be recognized young. They would be recognized within the first 7 years of their life for their sensitivity. And that sensitivity, it extends way beyond just a sensitivity towards other people, towards other human people, I should say. It's a
Mhm.
sensitivity that also extends towards the earth itself and towards our, what I call our more than human relatives, right?
Mhm.
Um, so the plants, the animals, the landscape, the rivers, the mountains, the all of these different beings, let's say, that are part of that massive web of life and death that allows for us to exist. So this this person's grief bearer, they have a more heightened sensitivity to all of those things, and so they feel a lot more of the wounding that happens, not just along human generational lines, but also the wounding that happens to the land itself, the wounding that stays like soaked into the land itself, which is another big thing. Is that I think few people realize that the land itself has memory in a way.
Yeah,
And
like, you mean like, for instance, like, when I used to visit my grandmother, she would say something similar about the land that it had seen so much blood that it was that you could hear the echo of it in the night. Is that something like that?
exactly like that,
Wow.
exactly. And I remember where I grew up. There's a lot of violence where I grew up, and I remember going out to the desert as a kid. I mean, not just as a kid, but like throughout my life, going out to the desert and just kind of feeling into the land itself and feeling the way that um, all of the pain and all of the wounding there grows up and into the lives of the people, and it happens at a very unconscious level. And I mean, throughout the course of my life, I've traveled to many different places and been able to feel the difference in the people based on the differences in the land.
Wow.
So, for example, there, I always tell people, well, in the desert, everything has thorns,
Yeah.
including the people.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You know, but you feel the difference if you're in a place that is like say like a big forested area versus a desert versus like the plains or places near the ocean. You can actually feel the way that the land influences the heart of the people and the way that the people show up and the way that the people are. And having a sensitivity to all of this stuff as a kid and talking about this stuff as a kid, in those times it was not well received at all, at all.
Mm.
Um, and so there's a lot that comes along with that, but there's a lot of my own work of a lot of the healing work that I do emerged out of my life experiences and having to seek teachers that could help me make sense out of some of the more destructive aspects of myself and some of those patterns that I saw at an earlier age that I saw myself perpetuating. Because this really interesting thing happens where we may think on a conscious level that we're going against everything. If we grow up in a difficult environment or we grow up in a traumatic environment, we may think that we're going against everything that that environment was,
Mhm.
but it's like you can kick it out the front door, but it climbs in the back window
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
thing. And so until we really start to look at and address those deeper emotional and behavioral and energetic patterns, they keep popping up in our life over and over and over again. And so really there are, like, I like to tell people that I'm a river that's fed by many streams. So I studied many, many different traditions because I was so drawn to seeking wisdom and seeking wisdom from other, um, from as many places as I could that were earth connected and earth based, that were not like mainstream ideas of how life is or how it should be. Um, but the one that has most spoken to me over and over again and called me back over and over again is the Tolteca tradition,
Mhm.
which is kind of hard to, like, even calling it a tradition is kind of tricky because it implies that it's a unified thing. It's more like my experience of it, at least, right?
Mhm.
Is that it's like, if it's like a tree, it's like a tree that has many roots, and each of those roots is a unique expression that has to do with the people that carried the wisdom and the teachings in those places in relationship with the land itself in those places. So you can't really separate the teachings from the specific place and the relationship that people had with that place, because everything that lives emerges out of that direct relationship with the land. And so there are these shared stories, like taking, for example, the concept of Quetzalcoatl, that again is Gucumatz in some places, is Kukulkan in others, and there is kind of an overarching series of similarities, but there are also very specific, um, unique aspects to how it emerges because it's in relationship with the people and the land in that place, right?
Oh,
And
yeah,
so
so, like, the difference of environment, basically.
absolutely, it's like
Mhm.
we see this all the time with language and with food.
Mhm.
Like, I've grown up and lived in different parts of the states or different countries, and people will ask me things like, "Oh, well, is this traditional Mexican food?" And my answer is always, "Well, is it like what my mom cooked, or is it like what someone in Oaxaca would cook, or
Right,
someone in Chiapas, right? Or somebody in Sinaloa? Like, what do you mean by traditional?" Right?
right.
There's this idea that there's this unified thing and that that unified thing is it. But if you go to different parts of Mexico, the food is going to be different. Just
Mhm.
like same thing happens in the States, same thing happens anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
there are regional differences that have to do with the specific aspects of culture that emerge in that specific place. Um, but so over and over again, like, the things that called me back time after time were these much deeper teachings that come from, or that are named Tolteca teachings. And some of them come from up around where I'm from. So these border areas, some of them come from like the heart, the valley of Mexico, from where Mexico Tenochtitlan was. Some of them come from places further south, you know, and um, and I've seen these certain uniformities in those teachings that really steered and guided me. And so in the book, that's a lot of what I share are the ones that have really impacted my life and really helped me to um, do this work of healing the things that were passed on to me continually, because it's always an ongoing process. Like
Right.
there's no such thing as completion.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, so that's a little bit about where it came from, or where I came from.
that's pretty awesome. Yeah, because that's so true. It resonates like with different cultures, with different ways of living, I think. And it's so just reading the book. I'm not all the way done, but just I think 42 pages that I've read already. And like it hits home every time, every page, every sentence is like a mirror to me, like, oh, this is what that was. As a child, being a grief bearer, I, I I feel as though I'm a grief bearer, and
Mhm.
that my siblings are to a certain extent as well. But like you say in the book, they either lack the awareness or they distract themselves from that understanding. And as I dig much deeper into my own indigenous background, just by interviewing my aunts and stuff like that, it starts to, bubble up more and more how much we are really connected to the land. And being a sensitive person in that way, there's usually a feeling of aloneness or isolation in the world. And is that something that's common with sensitive people that are grief bearers? Or is it just kind of like a drama that we create in our minds as sensitive people?
I think it is something that's common. I think it is something that is I think it's a unique part of our experience that has to be acknowledged, because if it's not acknowledged, we fall into the trap of this dominant society that says there's something wrong with you. And the truth of it is that we live in a sick society. We live in a sick society and a sick culture uh, that's based on really thousands of years of untended grief and trauma. And it's something that I think, okay, so if if let's say like my great grandparents, hypothetically, they experience a traumatic event or traumatizing event, and they're told to keep quiet about it. They're told not to express what's going on with them, maybe because it's not safe.
Right.
And I was mentioning that lineage on my mom's side of the family, the Apache or Inde lineage. Well, there was a point in time in the history of this area where to be called Apache was a death sentence, right?
Mhm.
People were being paid by the government to hunt,
Yeah.
right, Apache people.
Hmm.
And so many people had to at a certain point, in order to survive, many people had to just become Mexican,
Right.
right? Well, there's a lot of hurt there. First of all, there's this disconnect from the way that your people have lived for thousands of years. There's the physical disconnect from the people that that are still attempting to live that way while they're being hunted down. And then there is the what I'd imagine, not only the survival fear, but the sense of guilt, right? And the sense of shame for having called yourself something else so that you could survive, right?
Right.
While those that you care about or that are still going through the other experience. But so all of that's silenced.
Hmm.
So what happens is that it starts to anchor itself inside the person. It anchors itself in the heart of that person. And that person can't express. the grief of it, they can't express the rage of it, they can't express any of those things. So it starts to it starts to seep into them inside, it starts to poison them inside. And then it starts to influence their closest relationships. So within one generation, let's say they have kids after that, or they already have kids when this is happening,
Mhm.
those kids start adapting to the behavior of the parents.
Right.
So then those kids have kids, and those kids are just born into that environment. And so by that point, it's just normal.
Mhm.
That's just the way things are, right? That's how mom and dad are. That's how grandpa and grandma are. That's just the way that things are. So there's no questioning if it could be another way. There's no notion that it ever was any other way. And then you have the rest of the community around, the pueblo, the village, whatever, around, just living in the same way and reinforcing the same things. So all of that sorrow and that fear and that grief gets swallowed down and becomes a presence in the heart of that person, but it's a presence that is never acknowledged. And as they have kids, they pass it on to their kids. And so their kids grow with it, not even realizing that it's there. It's like a parasite that they don't even realize is there. But then they start acting out in these destructive ways towards themselves and towards other people. But it's just the way that it is, right? So nobody questions it.
Mhm.
And you get generation and generation and generation of that until it gets to the point where people just think, well, no, like this is just normal, right?
Right.
Like our culture is based on what's our culture based on? Whoa, it's on like borracheras, right? And
Right.
like machismo, BS, and like all this other stuff, and like not caring about the land where we live, not tending to the places that we where we live, and like constantly being at war with each other. Um, People just think that that is the culture, but it's actually that thing, that kind of that parasite or that sickness of the heart that has taken over, right, and masked itself as the culture. Um, and so I think that's a lot of what really destroys communities and that destroys individuals. And I think that the grief bearer feels that. Not I think, I know. I know that the grief bearer feels that. And the grief bearer can feel it like generations deep.
Yeah, and it's like, for me at least, I feel like there was times where in my past where I've, looked at things and I feel a certain way, but I don't understand why. I'm like, why do I feel this way? There's nothing that makes sense for me to feel this certain way. And then as, years went on and my mother would tell me stories about her life, I would be like, oh, that's weird. Like, oh, I whistle a lot like my grandfather, or I sing like my grandmother on my dad's side or something like that. And you like, just like those traits, I feel like we like the grief breaks through, but we can't understand it because we don't know where it comes from, you know? But
Absolutely.
in that way, like, how can we, as grief bearers, not be a detriment to ourselves and start understanding where that grief comes from?
Yeah. Well,
You
I think it starts with just recognizing that this is a thing.
Mhm.
Just by becoming aware of it and being able to realize, okay, like because this culture, this society will try and convince us over and over again that we're the broken one.
Mhm.
But I think by having a by having a word, by having something that we can point at that says, no, this makes sense of it, and this is something that's real, we can start to realize that it's not that we're broken, it's that we're the ones that feel and see what nobody else wants to,
Wow. Yeah.
which is a huge um it's a huge weight, right? It doesn't make the carrying of it easier, let's say.
Mhm.
um but it starts to make it less isolating, because ultimately I think the destruction, I think all of the destruction really that humans do to themselves and to others comes from this illusion of being isolated, of being disconnected. And I think that when a grief bearer can hear that term and can realize there are other people out there like this, I'm not alone, then we start getting rid of that sense of isolation and disconnection. Because when a person feels like they're isolated in this, in feeling this, and in carrying this, um, all of that rejection that they feel from the outside world, they turn inward and they
Mhm.
start rejecting themselves, and they start judging and criticizing themselves and beating themselves up because they're not normal, like, so to speak. Right.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but we can start to see that normal isn't normal, you know, and we can start to see also that there's a way to and through this. And so in these traditions that really like grew me, what I learned was that in intact cultures, a person that is carrying this potential would not only be recognized young, but they would start to be guided at a young age.
Mhm.
And they would learn different ways for grounding and processing the emotional burden. Um, and a lot of that ends up happening ritualistically. A lot of that ends up happening through ritual, through ceremony, and through certain kinds of witnessing or listening to those that are bringing you their grief. Because another aspect of being a grief bearer is that whether you want it or not, people will come and pour all of their emotional baggage out onto you,
Yeah.
starting really young,
Mhm.
starting really young. And what happens when we don't have any kind of guidance with this is that we absorb it.
Yeah.
We like take it into ourselves and we think that it's ours.
Mhm.
And so that adds to, like you were saying, like there are times where you realize that you're feeling certain things and you're like, I don't even know where this comes from. Well, that happens to us in time in terms of the ancestral stuff that we carry, but it
Mhm.
also happens like horizontally in space because we'll take on and we'll absorb the stuff of the people that are nearest to us. And there comes a point where it's just completely overwhelming,
Mhm.
and you don't know what to do with it. But if you go and try to talk to somebody else about it that doesn't get it, then they'll just put it back on you. Well, what's
Yeah,
wrong with
like,
you?
it's almost like they don't hear it. They don't like, no matter what words you use, they don't get the concept, and it's just like it's like talking to a brick wall sometimes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's all kinds of people for all kinds of things in the world.
Mhm.
So it's I think when I was younger and occasionally still, I'll get frustrated with people that don't see or don't understand or don't feel certain things. But the the older I've gotten, the more experiences I've had, the more I realize, well, it's because it's not for everybody to do this work,
Right.
which I think is important as well because nowadays the popular thing is this idea of being a healer. And so
Mhm.
nowadays there's so many different people um, that want to call themselves the thing, but don't really have the like it's not genuine in them. And like one of the things that I bring up a lot, like with my students and with people that I mentor, is the awareness that education and vocation are not the same thing, right?
Right.
Anybody can seek out an education in something, but a vocation, that's like a calling. That's something that a person is born with, right?
Yeah.
And I think that nowadays there are a lot of people that maybe are not very clear about why they're here or what they really feel called to do. And so they just decide, well, I'm going to be a healer, right? I see all these other people doing it and it looks cool. and it looks fun, whatever. So I'm going to do it. Um, and my experience of it is that it's incredibly, incredibly hard work.
Mhm.
And a lot of times it's work that is not even recognized or acknowledged, you know. But so I think in these intact ways and intact cultures, a person would be guided and would be taught from a really young age. These are the
Mhm.
things that we do. This is how you help somebody separate out, right? Like the energetic baggage or the energetic wounding from the mental wounding, from the physical aspects of the wounding. You know, in the flowering war, um, I I bring up or I propose this model, this idea that I call the Teocalli method.
Mhm.
And so the Teocalli addresses really like five main aspects of our lives: the physical, the emotional, the mental, the social, and then the spiritual. And any kind of wounding experience has an impact, has a component part at each one of those levels. And so growing and learning about this, you also start to see how like the very fragmented approaches to healing that exist in our society only get limited results because they're only focusing on very specific aspects or areas of things. I think
Right.
nowadays we see in the mental health realm, we see more of this focus on somatics, which is fantastic. You know,
Yeah.
we start to see more of the entirety of the human being, but there's a lot still that is left or set aside. You know, when we talk about spiritual aspects of life and living, and and that means very different things to very different people. um for years I've worked in like Mexican American communities and in like um communities of undocumented people from Mexico, different parts of the country. And you can't you can't apply the Western model or the Western idea of mental health um, many times because there's a lot that's missing to the understanding of the relationship that we have to the world and these kinds of relationships to ancestry and to spiritual beliefs and things like that. And so I think grief bearers, they we have this potential. We're born with this potential, and it's a powerful one that has a lot of responsibility attached to it. But we have to undergo this entire process to learn how to take that potential and turn it into something that's useful for the community, to something that's useful for other people. Um, where if we were in an intact village a few hundred years ago and everything was seen. When I use that term intact, what I mean is a culture that understands that there is this massive web of both seen and unseen forces that allow for life to happen.
Mhm.
And we have to live in such a way that we honor all of those. And so there are spiritual aspects to that the culture that we live in doesn't acknowledge at all, doesn't recognize at all. Um, and then there are the physical aspects of it that have to do with relationship, our relationship to the earth, to the plants, to these more than human relatives, our indebtedness to all of those things, and living in such a way that there is an entire um, spiritual or ritualistic component to how we live every single day, where we're constantly in this communication with the forces that create life around us on physical levels and on these unseen, more subtle levels. And and I think for a grief bearer, it is absolutely essential to learn how to live in these more intact ways because you also start to heal the wounds, not just like I'm saying at the human level, you start
Mhm.
to heal the wounds of relationship at like earth-based levels and also cosmic levels. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I think is phenomenal, and I'm always learning and gonna be learning. Um, if I live to be 100, I'm never gonna stop learning about it. But it's about the Tolteca understanding of the cycles of time and space and relationship, and it is something that is loosely referred to as a calendar or a calendar system, and it's so much more than that. It's so
Mhm.
much more than that. But it really does teach about how, at the most like minute levels in our lives, we're influenced by the sun, by the moon, by the position of different astronomical forces. Um, and the so to give you an example, one of the things that I do, that I actually introduce in the book too, um, but that I do often with my students, is a practice that's called stilling the waters, and it's a writing practice that is it's not something that your mind is guiding. It's more like a practice that allows for the part of you that thinks it's running the show to step
Mhm.
aside, and you just write whatever comes to mind for a chunk of 20 minutes every night, but you do it for 28 nights.
Mhm.
And the whole point of that is to get the person to start to realize that we have emotional cycles. All of us have emotional cycles
Yeah.
that follow lunar cycles as well. And there are peaks and there are valleys, right? There are highs and there are lows during the course of that 28-day cycle.
Mhm.
And if we start to continuously track those things, we start to understand our own rhythm, and we start to understand the rhythms of our emotions during those 28-day periods. And so you'll get to know, okay, well, during this week, like, a bunch of things start coming up to the surface. I start feeling more sensitive. I start feeling more edgy. I start, um, wanting to get into fights with people, or have less patience with people during that time, right? And then, and so you can plan accordingly. So you don't take things personally in the way that you used to, because you
Mhm.
start to realize, like, no, this is something that's bigger than just that person that cut me off, or, my partner or roommate that didn't do the dishes, or whatever. Like, you
Yeah.
start to realize that there are bigger things that are at play that influence you in your life. The same thing goes for waking up every day with the sunrise and going outside and greeting the sun. Now
Mhm.
there's a ton of research on the positive influence of this, like the positive physical benefits of this for our bodies, right?
Mhm.
Um, but so when I'm talking about these ritualistic forms of living, and I'm talking about these ways of living in relationship with the unseen world, I'm also talking about tangible, practical things.
Mhm.
I think a lot of times when people hear things like that, like the spiritual side of things, or they hear about the unseen world or whatever, people think that it's somehow disconnected or not practical, right, to day life. But it is very much so. And so I think a lot of what a grief bearer carries is rooted, or is grounded when they start living in these intact ways again, when they start building a foundation for their life that is in direct relationship with nature and the natural cycles. A lot of that like emotional and energetic burden starts to stabilize itself, because the person starts to stabilize themselves. They start
Mhm.
to build a much stronger foundation for themselves and for who they are. And then comes diving into the work of, it's like unpacking all of those personal wounds first, and then the generational or the familial wounds. And so, the teachings that I offer people, like, they're always coming back to things that we see in nature, to things that are reinforced over and over and over again in nature, because that's what we are. We're walking microcosms of the earth and the cosmos. And
Mhm.
if we start to understand our lives in those ways, if we start to align our lives in those ways, we start realizing that we already have these tools that are really powerful to help us start to heal what's ours and then what was passed on to us. And so healing happens in these, it's like ripples, concentric circles.
Mhm.
It has to start with what is ours, and then it opens to what is our families, and then what is our communities, and then what is our societies, and what is our worlds. Right?
Mhm.
Everything moves from the center outward. Part of what I think is really tricky in the world that we live in now is that people want to change things from the outside in. And I don't think that leads to very lasting results, if at all. We have to start exactly where we are. And so it's, again, where are you? Like at any given point in time, right? Where are
Mhm.
literally, where are your feet planted? Right? If you wake up every day and you go outside and you step barefoot on the earth, you say, I'm right here. Well, who showed up so that you could be alive that day? The earth beneath your feet, the sun that's shining down on you, right? The wind that is all around you, that is providing your breath, the water that you drink, all of the different lives that went into the food that you eat.
Mhm.
And that is independent of whether or not a person eats meat or not, right?
Mhm.
Because everything that we consume comes from things that have died and decayed. Just like there will come a point in time where it's our turn to feed life. Right?
Yes. Mhm.
And so this is how we start to understand this intactness. It's how we start to understand that, first of all, we're not isolated. Second, what we do matters, right?
Yes.
What we do matters, and it ripples out and it affects a lot more than what we're aware of. And then third, some of us carry more, and some of us have the capacity to turn that into medicine for ourselves, for others, so that what was passed on to us doesn't get passed on from us to whoever comes next, uh,
Mhm.
with the added burden of all the stuff that we didn't process for ourselves or heal for ourselves. Um,
Mhm.
so, yeah, I don't know if there was a question.
Yeah, definitely. That answered quite a few of my questions because like, it shows you that you're even though we don't live in an intact society, that we can still live intact within ourselves, and like you say, resonate that healing from within us as an example to people around us, so that they see that there's something to it, and they might change their behavior or their way of thinking or the way of even seeing you. But with parents and, families, being an integral part of a child growing up, what can parents do or family members do to help cultivate that grief bearers, sensitivities and like
Mhm.
them living in more of an intact environment? Is it just living by example or doing other things?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think I think first and foremost, it it's people realizing that this is a thing, realizing that we're constantly picking up on each other's emotional state or each other's energy. And we all got baggage.
Oh yeah.
Every single one of us does. Um, but we don't all want to acknowledge it or look at it or do the work of healing it. And I think a lot of it comes back to what I was saying earlier, to a culture of shame, where people feel like if they acknowledge that they have emotional hurt, emotional wounding, then there's some kind of shame attached to that. So we live in a culture, or we live in a society where people have put the idea of competence on a pedestal,
Mhm.
where you're supposed to walk around acting like you've got it all together all the time.
Yeah.
And that's not what humanity is. Like, to be human is messy.
Yes.
You know, to be
Mhm.
human and like honestly be who you are, it has ups and downs. There are good days, there are bad days. There are times where you succeed at the things that you're trying to do. There are times where you fall on your face. Like, all of those things are part of being a human being. And and I think that the most important thing that people can do to support that that grief bearer, that person in their family, is to look at themselves, and like to honestly look at themselves, and to work to heal whatever their untended wounding is, um, but also to be willing to be curious, and to be wrong, to be willing to be wrong, um, because a lot of times it is that it's that idea that a person has to be right all the time, and that there's a power dynamic there.
Mhm.
So, like, parents that have a kid that is picking up on something that does not reflect very well on the parents, it's easier for those parents to shut that kid out, or to shut him up, right? Or her up, whatever it may be,
Mhm.
um, and keep trying to pretend like they've got it all together, than it is to actually consider what the kid is saying and say, well, wait, maybe I do need to look at something. Maybe there's this communication that's a two-way street here. But another thing too is that I think it's really important for people to start prioritizing relationships and the health of their relationships, and extend the idea of those relationships beyond just their human relationships. Right?
Mhm.
Extend that idea of relationship to the places where they live, and how they take care of, or tend to the places where they live, and and make that a priority over the way that they think others see them.
Yeah.
So prioritize relationship over social status, and most definitely prioritize relationship over material things, you know. Um,
Mhm.
so I think it's a big restructuring of our idea of what success is. Success isn't material wealth. Success isn't how many followers you have or what your social status is.
Mhm.
Success is the quality of relationships with the people in your life, and with the place that gives you life. And I think if we can start to restructure that, or see things in that way, it really, um, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable at first, because it makes us reevaluate a lot of things in our lives. Um, but then it creates the opportunity, or the possibility, for us to really listen to to those that are born carrying or feeling the wounding in the land, in the people around them, um, in their parents, in their grandparents, in their lineage, and then be curious when a kid starts to exhibit those kinds of sensitivities, not just try to limit it or shut it down, but to be curious about it, and to seek to learn more about this also. Realize that there's a lot more in the world that people can learn about how to live in healthier ways, and it's not the mainstream stuff, not by not by a long shot.
That really resonates with me because it like maps out things that I can do to better myself so that my niece or other my nephew can like see me as an example
Mhm.
the things that they can do, or, me being able to see them, in their sensitive ways, and cultivating that, and helping them in any way that I can, so that they're not left behind, or like, fraught with addiction, or like with all this stuff that I feel like I carried for a long time, that, it took me through a really twisted road. Like I tell people sometimes, it took me on a weird journey, but it
Mhm.
brought me back to a place of understanding, of like that all that stuff that happened, all that sacrifice, that experiencing, the isolation, all those things were for a reason, that I needed to find the road that I'm on now, which is like, finding that understanding of who I am, in this place and time, and who I can be for the future people, for the ripple effect of the land, But this book really, really helped focus that understanding of all these things that I've been looking for all these years, like having gone to MEPs myself, and having built one, and like all those things I feel were for a reason, like these, it doesn't feel as isolating as it did before. So I think this book is really important for people to read, even just, even if they don't feel that they're a grief bearer, that they
Mhm.
can benefit from the knowledge that it provides, But I really want to thank you so much, Oscar, for all your insight and decades of dedication to the subject, and most of all for writing The Flowering War, which is, you can get on Amazon. If you guys are interested, you can check out the link tree for Tending the Fire, which is, uh, the Tending the Fire is a community that you created, correct, to help cultivate some of these practices.
Yeah, yeah, it is. So for years I tended fires for lodges and for different things, and it's a longer story where the name comes from, but but I I realized at a certain point that we've all got this we've got this flicker, we've got this flame that we're born with, and it has everything to do with why we're here. And the the world that we live in tends to bulldoze over it and try to tell us who and what we're expected to be. Um, and if you don't keep that fire alive, if it smolders out, then you live like in the book. I call it the procession of the Walking Dead. Uh,
Mhm.
you're just kind of a zombie going through the same routines day in and day out. Or you can go in the opposite end and live this life of resistance and rage, which feeds that fire to the point where it burns you up and it burns everything else around you. Which all of that I had direct life experience with as well. So I wanted to say to what you mentioned, all of us that have been through really really hard things and that have put ourselves through really really hard things have the unique ability to understand others that are in that place now.
Mhm.
So all of those experiences that were the hardest become the most potent medicine when we can heal from the roots of why we did it to ourselves. So, so yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate just all the knowledge, and you sharing all this with us. And I hope this resonates with quite a few people, makes you guys feel seen, and helps you guys find the healer within you. So thank you so much, and many blessings.
Thank you, Adriana.